Hi, welcome to the lesson 4 of our Spring Boot course. In this video, we are going to create our first Spring Boot web application or a first Spring Boot application, right? We will start from the scratch and we are gradually going to build this one. But this is going to be a very simple uh, Spring Boot application, and the idea is that you will get the basic understanding of the layout and the structure of the Spring Boot project. Okay, what we are going to cover in this lesson, we are going to create a Spring Boot application. We will be adding the dependencies using pom.xml, which is a Maven file. I'm going to discuss a little bit more about it, so just hold on for a second. We are going to run our application. There is a main method which that is the entry point for the Spring Boot application. We will have a little bit more discussion around the main method. Okay, and finally, apart from the main method, we can also create an executable jar. That's the reason why we call Spring Boot as ready to run application. So it's basically we are going to create an executable jar and we'll run it. Okay. Um, the reason why we are choosing this approach is we are not going to use any of the existing tools. If we are using any of the IDE editors, right? They all of the editors have the built-in support for the Spring Boot. So you use their wizards and they are going to create the Spring Boot structure. But that won't give you the idea, the basic idea, what are the different building blocks of the Spring Boot project, right? So that's the reason what we are going to do is we are going to create a simple Maven project and then we will keep on building it. That's going definitely going to give you an idea what are the different things into the pom.xml. When you make any changes to that one into the pom.xml file, how that overall going to impact into the dependencies and other part of your applications. Okay, so let's get started. Okay, so I'm going to create a new Maven project. So you have two options. You can use an artifact or you can just create a blank Maven project. It's up to you. How do you want to go with that one? I'm not going to use the artifact. Okay. So for the group, I'm going to set it as a Java dev journal. Artifact ID is Spring Boot app. Going to name it as a Spring Boot app. Okay. Okay. Let's click on the finish. This is the basic structure of our Maven project, right? Now we are slowly going to add the Spring Boot capabilities to this. Okay. Before we start doing that, I just want to highlight one thing. There is an external library section in this one, right? If you're on a different ID, they may have a dependent jar section or something like that. But if you see right now, what does that mean is that these are the libraries or these are the jars which like my application is dependent on. So in order to build or in order to run the application, I need to have those jars into the class path. Otherwise, my application is not going to work. Uh, uh, just taking an example. If you want to build a web application, you need the Spring Web MVC capabilities, right? So when you're building those kind, everything will come into these external libraries. And currently, because this is a plain Maven project, there is no dependency, right? There is nothing there in it. Okay. Uh, Once we start building it, there will be a couple of dependencies. Those will be added. So we are going to keep a close eye on those one. Okay. So let's add couple of things into our this pom.xml file and see how it's going to impact our overall structure. Okay. First thing what we added is the parent section in our pom.xml, right? As I said, this is a core concept of the Maven architecture. But the interesting part is in our case, we are defining the Spring Boot starter parent as the parent of our application, right? There are a number of different things which are being provided by this parent. Those are the sensible defaults, we call it. Let's not get just to keep it this is simple, and I'm not going to complicate it because I want to discuss that in a separate lesson. But this section brings a couple of default, as I said, sensible default to the application. Maybe, for example, what is the default Java language, which is 1.8, what is the source encoding, uh, the packaging goals and all those steps. So those are being automatically, your application will going to inherit those once you have this defined as a parent. So uh, we, as I said, right, we are definitely going to discuss this in a more detail, because this is one of the fundamental concept while you are working onto the Spring Boot application. All right. The next thing what I'm going to add to this section is, we are going to build a Spring Boot application, right? So what I want is, I want to add a, the web capabilities to our application. So I'm going to add a dependencies, and then I'm going to add or dot spring framework dot boot, and then because I want to create a web application, I'm going to add a Spring Boot starter web. Okay, the moment you added it, what does that mean is, I'm telling Spring Boot that, hey, I want to create a web application. And if you see, the moment I added the dependency, there are certain external libraries, those were automatically added by the Spring Boot, right? It added the Spring dependencies, right, all these ones. It automatically added that embedded Tomcat. It automatically added the logging capabilities. So this is, there are two things here. One is the opinionated things, which is a core of the Spring Boot, which says, okay, you asked me to create a web application. In my opinion, these are the default things you need in order to start working onto the web application. So I'm going to give you these dependency and these tools. So this is how it's going to work. And how does it takes an opinion, the Spring Boot, that works with the what we call it as a starters in the Spring Boot. So right, there is a two things in a combination. So starters, we will be having a deeper look into the starters, but it is a set, it basically give an understanding, or you're going to tell the Spring Boot that what kind of dependencies you want to bring into the pictures. Other interesting factor which I want to highlight again is, you you have only indicated that you want to create a web application. Spring not only added these dependencies, but it also have chosen the version for you. For example, 5.1.2, 2.1.0, Tomcat 9.0, Jackson is 2.9.7, Log 4j is 2.11, there is a SLF4j which is 1.7, right? All these dependencies are automatically picked for your application, and this is where the intelligence of the Spring Boot comes into the picture. It knows what are the compatible versions and what are the compatible jars, right? Those will be automatically bring into the picture. You don't have to worry about whether this jar is going to be compatible or not. Everything is going to be taken care for you, and some of the sensible defaults like what is the version and all those things are being brought because we added this parent. Those, that information resides into the Spring Boot starter parents. Okay. Okay, the next thing what I'm going to do is, I'm going to create my a simple controller. Okay, I'm going to call this as a REST controller, and let's call it as a home, and we are going to return hello world. The last thing which I need is the request mapping, correct? Okay, so we have created a controller. Now the only part remaining is, we need to add the entry point for our right. So we call it as our we will call it as a boot app example. Okay, you can name it anything. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to add a simple public static void main method, and then I'm going to call a spring application. Okay, this is the one dot run method, and this method needs the class name, which is this. Okay, and it also needs, you can pass on the arguments to this one. And the last step for us is to add the annotation, Spring Boot application annotation. Okay, so I think we are almost done with our application configurations. Okay, but before we get into more details, I quickly want to discuss about this annotation, the Spring Boot application annotation. Okay, so this is the main or the building or to put it in a different way, this is the core annotation of the Spring Boot application. Okay, uh, and in short, this annotation is a combination of three different annotations. If I want to put it in a different way, this is nothing but a combination of at the rate of configuration. So as I said, this is combination of configuration annotation, enable auto configuration annotation, and the component scan, right? Uh, if I'm hoping that you are familiar with these annotations. These are the annotation which are used into the Spring framework and spring-mvc framework. Uh, but if you're not if you're not familiar, just to give you an idea, the configuration is basically used to register the bean uh, in the context, or you can also import the configuration classes. So you basically tell the Spring container that these are my configuration classes, these are needed to create the configuration other part of it, right? Component scanning is another important feature excuse me, which basically it's basically enable the component scanning, and you can also pass the packaging saying, okay, this is the location where my application is located at, right? So for this, keep in mind that this works based upon all. If you put it into the root, like if you have application onto the root package which is annotated with the component scan, it is going to scan all the classes in that package, as well as all the sub packages of it. Okay, so you have to be careful like where the component scan will come into the picture. So for example, you want to tell your application that my controllers are into the package com.java devjournal.controller. So you can obviously start the component scanning from com.java devjournal.controller. So it's going to scan everything. Okay. Enable auto configuration. It's basically going to enable the Spring Boot auto configuration mechanisms, right? I will discuss more about it, but just keep in mind that your Spring Boot application is the combination of all those three things. Okay. So at this point, we are almost ready with our to run our first Spring Boot application, right? There is another very interesting aspect to the Spring Boot application is there is a very a configuration file that is available in the Spring Boot right now there, because we haven't used any of the built-in tool, so there is nothing available into this one, but we call it as a application.property file. It is nothing but a property file, so you can always say application.properties file. Okay, and This is the property file which is used to control the your application behavior, right? We haven't defined anyone. I'm going to delete this for now. So when we are inheriting, when we added this parent thing, right, that the default application.property file is will be inherited by your Spring Boot application, right? The moment you create your own application.property file, and if you define any of the properties, if you override the values, it is going to use your custom values, right? So let's run our first Spring Boot program. Okay. All right, so our first Spring Boot application is up and running right now. It's running on a 8080 port. Okay, let's see our application into action. I'm going to use simple localhost 8080 and we have our hello world application. Okay, we close this chapter or the lesson. I quickly want to discuss another important aspect of the Spring Boot structure or the project structure is our main method, right? uh, this was a web application, but still we have a main method, right? So Spring in itself is follow a Java convention, and this main method is going to be the entry point for your application. Okay, uh, there is nothing specific or nothing different about it, just a convention it follows. um, Internally what is going to happen is Spring Boot is our main method is going to delegate the work to the Spring Boot application, Spring application class, because we are calling the run method, correct? uh, this run method uh, does a number of different things. It's going to bootstrap your application. When I'm saying it's going to bootstrap our application, what does that mean? These statements create have a number of different uh, kind of points to it. The first thing, what it does, it's going to start the Spring for you. It's going to start the Spring IOC container, because you need a certain things. You need a dispatcher servlet. You need a filters in order for your Spring Boot application or a Spring MVC application to work. Everything will be bootstrap when the you basically run the main method. So this is going to bootstrap your Spring, as I said, right? It's going to start your Spring. It is also going to start the auto configuration mechanism. So that means it's going to create an embedded Tomcat for you. It's going to start that embedded Tomcat for you, and ultimately the application will be running on that embedded Tomcat. uh, the other part is, why do you what is the reason why I'm passing this Spring Boot our app example dot class as one of the parameter to the run method? Okay, the reason why we pass this information along with the arguments which are being passed to the main method, because you can control the behavior of your Spring Boot application when it's starting up. So that's the reason I can pass on the arguments. But the reason why I'm passing the boot app example class as one of the parameter is because it's going to tell, or it's going to indicate the Spring the underlying Spring boot mechanism, that which is the primary Spring components. Okay, uh, so that's the reason, because right now my main class or my primary class is Spring our boot app example, right? So I'm just indicating the underlying Spring Boot mechanism, right? And I said arg is something where you can pass the command line argument to your application. Okay, the last part of application is you really don't want to run your application every time from your ID, right? Once your application is ready to be installed onto the production environment, you need a different way. Yeah? You need to package your application, right? You cannot run that from the editor. So let's add the capabilities to build or to package our Spring Boot application. Okay, to add that capabilities, what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a Spring Boot plugin. to our pom.xml file. Okay, so I have added this section to my pom.xml, so it's going to give the packaging capabilities to my application, right? um, there are a number of executions or the goal executions which are a part of the or the Maven. Those all those things will be added automatically to your Spring Boot application because those goals are defined into the parent, okay, that the Spring Boot starter parent. So these capabilities will be automatically inherited to your application. Let's stop this one, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to build the application. If you see right now in the target section, there are classes, there are generated source. What I'm going to do is I'm going to build that one. Okay, all right. So my application, okay, I have my application has been created. There is a jar which has been created on this section, right? If you see Spring Boot app, which is basically everything is installed here. And if I look into the other part of it, it says that on the target section there is a Spring Boot app 1.0.start.jar. Okay, and this is the jar file which I'm talking about. Finally, if you want to run your application, okay, you just have to run this simple java hyphen jar command, and then you need to give the location, right? And for us it is going to be springboot.jar. You see our application is starting up. So our application started. So this time I was not using the id run method, but I have used this time. I have created the packaging of the jar for my application, and then I'm running it with the standard run command, right? How you can run a jar file into the Java. Uh, there are a few other things. I haven't defined the packaging option for my Spring Boot application, right? I haven't identified whether I'm going to create a jar or I'm going to create a war file. The default one is jar, but to your surprise, right? Uh, there was like you might have not seen that, okay, for a web application you are packaging everything into the jar file, correct? This is something new where Spring Boot has done it's kind of we call it as executable jar or a fat jar into the Spring Boot. It's not a standard Java jar files where, because they have the limitation of that they cannot load the nested jar files, right? So in order to handle that scenario, Spring Boot has come up have used a different approach which is called uber jars or fat jars. Sorry. Okay. All right. Congratulations. So we have created our first Spring Boot application, right? Just to summarize what we learned in this one is, first thing, that Spring Boot is intelligent enough when we add the dependency. We tell Spring Boot that, okay, I want to create a web application. It automatically going to take care of a couple of things. We saw that example where we said I want to create a web application, then it's automatically added the required dependencies along with the version IDs for that one, right? So that's the first thing. Second thing is there is a standard convention it follows. There was a simple main method, and that main method is an entry point for our Spring Boot application, which is running our application, right? There is nothing, even if it's a web application, it was a standard main method with a run command, right? That's the second thing we learned about it. And third thing, we got a better clarity why we call Spring as an opinionated framework, And what are the we got a hint of the auto configurations, right? And the last part what we learned about is that Spring Boot create executable jars. We also call this a fat jars or a uber jars, which is another way where you can create a ready to run jar applications.